Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm going to spotlight myself so everybody can see me. Then, since there's so many of us tonight, I'm delighted by, um, I know what a big topic of interest this is for everybody. And I'm going to let people in at the same time. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for this important conversation on parenting unvaccinated children in a post-vaccinated world. I'm Rachel Nelson. I'm the Director of Educational Initiatives and Intergroup Outreach at the Jewish Federation of Greater Portland. And folks keep coming in the waiting room, so sorry about that. This program is being brought to you tonight by the Jewish Federation of Greater Portland and by Jewish Family and Child Services. Thank you again for joining us this evening. Wowie, sorry, people keep coming in the waiting room. This is such a complex conversation and one that is not easy. The CDC keeps changing guidelines, things every day. It feels like there are constant changes and we don't always know how to respond and who to see. And then those of us who are enrolled in preschools, it's a different conversation because we're also guided by the early learning division and other things like that. So while I work at the Jewish Federation of Greater Portland, I'm also the parent to two preschoolers. I have a 2-year-old and a 3.5-year-old. And when vaccinations started rolling out, I was completely lost on who could I see, what could I do, where could I take my kids? So I turned to my pediatrician and I brought her a list of scenarios and went through person by person and list by list of who could I see, where could we go, what could we do? And she was so patient with me. She went through every single scenario with me. And I realized that I'm probably not the only person who had these questions. So I asked if she would be willing to share with the community. And she did. She agreed. So thank you, Dr. Meyer, for agreeing. I also want to thank, while there's also this medical component, there's also a mental health component that's really important when we look at reintegration and coming back into the community. So I want to thank Dinah for coming on to speak about that. And finally, we're a Jewish community and many of us use Judaism to guide us in what we do in our actions and our conversations. And thank you, Rabbi Posen, for bringing those points in. So I want to quickly formally introduce our presenters. Erika Meyer, sorry, more people come in joining us, is a pediatrician and mother of 3. She is a member of Congregation Neve Shalom, serves on the board of Jewish Family and Child Service, and is active in Federation's Women's Giving Circle. Dr. Meyer is a graduate of Harvard Medical School and completed a residency at Dornbecker's Children's Hospital. Before medical school, she studied anthropology and taught 1st grade. She's been in private practice with Metropolitan Pediatrics since 2003. Her professional passions are in child development and building resiliency in children and families. Dinah Gilburd is a licensed clinical social worker with Jewish Family and Child Service. She presents workshops in the Jewish community that support the mental health needs of children, adolescents, and families. As a child and family therapist, Dinah has had over 25 years of experience. She relocated from Boston, where she worked as a supervisor and clinician at Massachusetts General Hospital in the outpatient behavioral and counseling department. And as the associate rabbi of Congregation Neve Shalom here in Portland, Rabbi Eve Posen delights in learning and teaching all ages and stages of her community. Rabbi Posen has taken up distance walking over the last year. You might see her walking right now. And although I think she stopped in a minute, and recently hit a new record of 30 miles, although she might be hitting 31 today, and is mother to Shiri and Matan, partner to Duncan, and human pillow to Stanley the dog. So the way it's going to look like tonight, each presenter will have about 7 minutes to present, and then we will have time for Q&A. When we get to the Q&A, if you're comfortable raising your hands with the Zoom hands feature, you can ask your questions that way. You can also ask your questions to chat. And then, or I will put a link to a Google form where you can submit questions anonymously and I'll ask. Please remember that we do represent the broad cross-section of the community, so please speak in generalities. And I am going to pass it to Rabbi Posen.
I timed that so perfectly to end up undercover while it just started raining on me and stop walking in a safe space. Thanks, Rachel. It's so good to be here with also my pediatrician, Dr. Meyer. Well, not mine, but my children's. But really, let's be honest, she guides me too. So it's a team over here. And Dinah Gilburd, who also guides me and helps me as a parent as well. So it's really beautiful to be here with us as a community tonight. As often in these spaces, I find myself trying to reflect on, okay, what is the Jewish teaching that can hold me in this moment and help me sort of figure out how to move forward? And I was reading this week's Torah portion, which is called Parshat Beha'alotcha, and I was struck because one of the major teachings is this notion of a second Passover. And I don't know how many of you have ever read this little tidbit. It's like a tiny little tidbit. But basically, it says, if you miss the opportunity to do it the first time for Passover, you can do a one-day redo a month later, which we're not at a month later. We've already missed that for this year. But that concept really spoke to me because there's so many opportunities as a parent and as a human right now that I feel like I'm being asked to make once and done choices about. It doesn't feel like there's a lot of gray area when it comes to like signing up for school or camps. We might lose spaces. If we say yes to this birthday party, it may mean saying no to something else, or to a family visit. If we go to visit our family and we have to fly, it means saying no to school for at least a week after in our current guidelines. All of that for me makes me really understand this notion of Pesach Sheni, of a second Passover, because it's that reminder that we don't have to get it right the first time. That while in our lives we may feel like it's a one and done decision, the truth is we're all learning and growing. And the whole reason that this concept exists in the Torah is because there was this understanding that we don't always get to hit it the first time, that life happens and we might need another chance, or we might need to think about the gray area or needing another. I mean, I know I needed another month to get ready for Passover, right? Like, we have this imperative as a community to remember that we're all working towards celebrating and being together. And for some of us, it happens at the time when we were ready to leave Egypt. And for some of us, we use a little bit of extra time, and we have that understanding that we can do that when we're ready as well. And so I want to hold that notion, that second Passover, that moment of, it's not a do-over, but it's in our own time moment, in order to reflect on the world, that we can each do this when we're ready in our own space. And there is a framework that still guides us by community and holds that space for us, and can lift us up. Allah, it can lift us up in the work that we do together. And so I hope that tonight we will feel lifted up and empowered by knowledge and community, and knowing that we're not in this alone, and that we're all walking this path together.
Thank you, Rabbi Posen. I am going to pass it now to Dr. Meyer for a few minutes, and then we'll pass it to Dinah, and then Q&A. So
have to unmute. So hi, everybody. I think I want to save a lot of time for questions to be able to answer people's questions, but I want to answer some of the more predicting some of the questions that people have. One is just acknowledging, all of us, I think a lot of us have felt like, wow, kids are really being left out of this whole reopening thing. If you have children, I mean, it just feels so unfair. Like, they can't get vaccinated. Now children under 12 are just sort of like being thrown out there. And so I think the spectrum of how people feel, and what I see, is this fear of, how do I protect my kids, and why isn't anybody doing anything for my children? And then there's also the other side of maybe the less anxious of you, or of people that I talk to, who are just, they're not that worried about their kids. Actually, they feel their kids are safe, and they've provided a good cocoon of safety with everybody, all the adults being vaccinated. And so I want to talk a little bit about that too, and that I think the spectrum is okay. Like, there are people who, you make decisions based on your comfort level. And I mean, there's certainly some medical evidence that we can use to kind of help us inform those decisions. But I think it's really important not to judge people for their decisions and what they've done, and to kind of feel like you're doing what you can live with and feel the best about for your kids. There's a lot of right ways to navigate this. And if anybody thinks I will ever give like sometimes I do give black and white, absolutely yes or no answers. You can ask people who, if I'm your pediatrician, I'm willing to do that. But this is mostly gray area. So, think about your questions. I'm happy to ask them. Right now, we know that percent positives are finally going down in Oregon, so things are looking positive that way. We are still seeing a significant amount of cases every day, but actually, the percent positive of what we've tested, we're testing pretty well still. That might go down, but vaccine rates are kind of flattening a little bit as well. We're still kind of now getting to where we have to do the hardcore convincing people to be vaccinated. But things are looking positive for the outdoor season and summer season, that I think things might get really positive for us. I want to be optimistic and in that sense, but realistic. And I think the news has been pretty clear that for people who have this question about a vaccine, it looks like it's been well documented, or not well documented, but well published in the news, that Pfizer is planning on applying for the 2 to 11-year-olds in September. There's some thought that it might end up being 5 and 6 and up, and not 2 to 11. But a lot of what I've seen is that they have the same amount of data from ages 2 to 11 years old. So September is not that far away. If we end up having a lot of cases of COVID this summer, that data might come faster, because that speeds up the trial when there's more cases. If we completely flatten the curve and COVID disappears, that will delay the trial and it'll take longer, but then we won't have as much COVID, so it'll be okay. So I'll save the rest of my time for questions.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm gonna now ask Dinah.
Thank you, Rachel. And really, thank you to you, Rachel, for putting this program together. Thank you to Dr. Rabbi Posen, sorry, for such inspiring words, I know. And thank you, Dr. Myers, because I think we're going to follow the science as you answer the questions. So my focus tonight is on the mental health perspective. It's on the emotional impact of parenting your unvaccinated children in a post-vaccinated world. And because this topic is so complex, and the truth is I could do a whole workshop on this topic. And in fact, I might, so you might have to stop me, Rachel, okay? But I want to hone in on two aspects of it. And it's almost like that families are dealing with right now. And it's almost like a perfect storm, because we have uncertainty and we have transition. And so you may yourselves right now be balancing and trying to figure out activities for your children that are safe along with their emotional well-being. So we all know that you are on uncharted territory with no definitive answers. And because families are unique and different, the needs of your family will drive your decision-making process. One size does not fit all. So let me begin by addressing the emotional impact of uncertainty on the family. So uncertainty has been pervasive throughout this pandemic. We know that uncertainty triggers anxiety. And as parents, you are the role models. And I always start with parents when I talk about the emotional impact on children, because as the role models, your children look to you in times of uncertainty and danger. They look to you to see how they ought to be managing their own stress. And if you are calm, your child feels assured. If you're upset, your child will not feel safe. Children, as you know, pick up on your feelings. They pick up on your language, your facial expressions, your tone of voice. And as you focus on the well-being of your children, I really want you also to focus on how you manage your own emotions. And in the words of the flight attendants, put on your oxygen mask first before you help another. And a quick way to do it, a quick way to put on your oxygen mask first is to use a simple technique of your breath. And when you're in a stressful situation, when you're feeling overwhelmed, when you just want to come down, just remember, take a breath. You will absolutely deactivate the stress response. And so now, along with managing uncertainty within your family, I want to talk about the transitional phase of reentry because it's so complicated right now with having unvaccinated children. We know that children thrive on routine, predictability, and consistency. And depending on their age and development and developmental stage, this change can be confusing and it can be frightening. And during this transitional phase, the range of feelings may range from relief and joy to fear and worry. So preparing your child for change can be very useful in helping them to adjust to new situations. Now, every child, like every family, is unique and different, and you know your child the best. So I'm just offering some very basic guidelines to prepare your child for change. So my suggestion to start out is to use age and developmentally language. With younger children, be concrete with visuals. Be aware of not overwhelming them with too much information because you want to leave space for their questions. This is actually the best part because it's your opportunity to find out what they are thinking and what they are feeling. And if your child has a frame of reference, your child may have attended a camp program last year, you may want to give more details about the change and explain the new guidelines and protocols. I want to give an example, which I think will point out some of what I'm talking about. From a case that I'm working on, I consult because I'm from Boston. I still have clients that, thanks to Zoom, can work with them on Zoom. And so I have changed a lot of the description of the family, but I feel like by giving an example, it will really describe what it is that I hope will be helpful for you. So Sarah is 5.5 years old. She lives with her family that includes her 3-year-old sister. And during the pandemic, she spent a few days at a program where she was learning remotely. And the family is basically socially distanced since the start of the pandemic. They've had very few visitors in the house, very little social interaction outside of the home. And her grandparents just recently started to visit. So parents decided to enroll Sarah in a gymnastic program because Sarah has been asking all year, when am I going to start gymnastics? This has been her passion. And so her mom didn't really go into a whole lot of description about what the new normal with gymnastics was going to look like. I also want to say before I get into this, that Sarah had been picking up on comments that her parents had been making to each other about the transition, about reentry, and about vaccinated not needing to wear masks. So when Sarah's mom started to say to her, are you getting excited? You know how parents do that. You know, are you getting excited? You know, what do you think about going back? Sarah didn't really respond. And that's when her mom contacted me. And I had known her before because we had worked on some regressive behaviors that were happening at the height of the pandemic. So I suggested a feeling chart because Sarah was not responding to some of what her mother was asking her. So some of you may be familiar with a feeling chart. It's pictures and children have expressions, right? Sad, angry, mad, surprised, you know, all those kinds of things. And what's great about the feeling chart is that it serves two purposes. One, it helps parents to gain insight into what their children are feeling. And the other is it helps a child to identify and to label what they are feeling. And when the feeling is labeled, it becomes more manageable and it's not as overwhelming. This, by the way, can also be used with older children, especially kids who don't express themselves as well and have difficulty with their feelings. And you can download these off the internet or you could create it with your child. And when Sarah's mother showed her the pictures, Sarah right away went to the scared face. And what she said to her mom, and she said the word out loud, She said, I am scared. So I want to pause for a moment because this is a critical point in listening to your child. And why? Because there are times when parents, and this is well-meaning and it comes from a place of love, but parents want to take the pain away. They want to take the sadness away. They want to take the hurt away. They want that feeling to go away. And they want to make the child feel better. But what ends up happening is that if the parent responds by saying something like, there's nothing to be scared of, or don't worry about it, or you'll be fine, what message does that send to the child? The message that it sends is that the emotion is wrong, or it's not allowed. It's dismissive of the feeling. But by validating a child's feeling, you make the connection. You make the connection with your child that you understand. And in the case of Sarah, this opening allowed the mom to gain a tremendous amount of insight into Sarah's fears. And what Sarah thought, because then mom was able to have her draw a picture, because some kids love to do that. In the picture, Sarah was the only one wearing a mask. And what she said to her mom was, I'm really scared that no one else is going to wear a mask, right? And I want to add that with older children who you are preparing for camp as well, or for any activity, you can make a list with 2 columns of what they think will be the same and what will change. I want to say that even activities like visiting with grandma, and we saw these really, heartwarming pictures of grandchildren running to their grandparents. And I had a mom call me to say that she has visited with her grandparents twice, and her 3-year-old will not leave her lap, right? So every family is different, every child is different, and you know your child the best. I just want to end, though, this really wonderful quote from Dr. Da Vinci. Dr. Da Vinci is a researcher, and she wrote this really fascinating article. She studied parenting and crises over 100 years. And her conclusion is, and she starts out, well, will the children be all right? Pandemic 2020. And her conclusion is, and this is what I'd like to share, what she says is, for now, the world is in a difficult state of uncertainty. We don't know the course of the virus, or what kind of normal life we will return to. But the enduring lessons for our children will surely be the emotional ones. So let's stay focused on and grateful for what really matters. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I am going to bring all of us onto, it's going to take me a second, onto the screen. And then we have some questions that have come in onto our Google form. And then if you would like to raise your hand with questions as well, or put them in the chat, either way, but I'll start with some of the questions that have come in. And I apologize, I have another screen over here, which is why I keep looking over here. So I will just start and with the questions. So this is for Dr. Meyer, what is the transmission rate outside from vaccinated to non-vaccinated, both combined with masks or no masks?
Am I unmuted?
Nope, you're good.
So
Yep,
I'm not going to be able to give you a transmission rate, but I can tell you a little more generally that question. First of all, the transmission rate from a vaccinated person with or without a mask is very low. The viral load has to be pretty significant. But the problem is we don't know in large numbers of people, it's possible that a vaccinated person could carry the virus. And there's a lot of factors that will go into this. But for example, if you're around hundreds of vaccinated people, chances are you're going to come across one of them that their vaccine didn't work. And then if that person is one of those people whose the vaccine was not effective, because we know it's not 100% chance, then is there a chance that that person was actually exposed and is carrying the virus and spreading it to you? So you have so many things that I hope that by explaining that seems that it's actually pretty unlikely, because there has to be the 2 things. One is you have to be around so many or so many vaccinated people that you'd come across the one person where it doesn't work. And then that one person has to be somebody who's out there getting exposed to other people who have the virus. So masks certainly reduce that risk significantly. I think the question, I didn't see the question in writing, but there was a question about the unvaccinated person wearing a mask or not wearing a mask.
Yeah, I think so. Both combined with masks or no masks.
Okay. So both people wearing a mask, I would say it's really, really minimal to none, right? It's very, very low, especially the vaccinated person. But if both people are wearing masks, we're very low. If the child is wearing a mask, they're reducing their risk significantly. When you have a vaccinated person not wearing a mask and a child wearing a mask, very low risk. A vaccinated person and a child not wearing a mask is also considered low risk because the person is vaccinated. That's not a high risk situation. Did I answer that?
I hope so. If not, please
so.
follow up in the
Yeah.
chat box. And
Yeah,
then
follow
along
up.
those lines, transmission from unvaccinated to unvaccinated, kid to kid outside, both with mask and without mask.
Yeah, so that outside, that is shown to be quite low. And I think if all those of you who have kids in preschool will have experienced this, we didn't see a lot of transition. In fact, most of the cases in preschools where children were exposed, they were actually exposed from a teacher or a caregiver who had it. So the rates even in daycare centers where children were under 2 and couldn't wear masks, and in preschools where there was kind of mixed use of masks and it's hard to be effective, transmission was quite low. And I was surprised by that. I mean, even at the beginning of the pandemic, we started to see that and we said, is that really? Why aren't kids spreading this? It turns out they weren't very good at spreading it. We also didn't do a lot of pan screening of every child. So it's hard to know those numbers, whether there was insignificant spread that we just never knew about. But there certainly were not significant numbers of symptomatic cases of COVID transmitting in schools of young children.
And transmission of vaccinated grandparents or other adults to kids. I'm assuming they mean transmission rate, if there is.
It's really low. I don't even know if there's a number. Really, really low.
So I think this is for mental health and for emotional health or physical health. Are outside hugs okay?
Outside hugs? You mean as opposed to inside the house hugs?
But I think so.
Hugs are okay. For those of you who are really worried, now, for example, if you have a really high risk grandparent who's not vaccinated or something like that, if there's situations, the other thing that's okay, I just always like to tell people, I learned this early on in the pandemic, is back hugs are okay. But hugging with the back to back and pushing backs together actually feels pretty good. So if you have someone you're not sure, I have started hugging my friends, my vaccinated friends. It has been, my mental health has improved dramatically. Being a vaccinated friend and being able to give them a hug has been really positive thing. For children, they should be able to hug their vaccinated family members and grandparents and people in your close network.
Okay, thank you. What would be the protocol, and this is relevant to this summer with traveling starting to open again, what would be the protocol if we wanted to stay with family? For example, vaccinated adults, but unvaccinated kids. When we return, should we quarantine? Should we test?
So when you travel, we are not getting great guidelines on who needs to quarantine anymore. So I might have to put a pause on that what that guideline is going to be. It might be different requirements for different situations. I think that if you're going to travel and be with a lot of unvaccinated kids that haven't been together, that are coming from a lot of different exposures, there is some risk to your kids transmit. Like, for example, I don't know, maybe they're thinking of like cousins, like you're going to go to New York and bring your kids that are unvaccinated from Portland to your family in New York, and there's unvaccinated kids there. Everybody goes to different preschools. You are bringing in a little more risk there. and of your kids transmitting something. So in that case, if you can get tested, that can be reassuring to make sure at least everyone's had a negative test. That reduces the risk somewhat, at least for that point in time. And you can make that just as far as the adults that are all vaccinated, they should be fine. They shouldn't have to wear masks. And then you just kind of have to decide, these are those tough ones. Like, we want these kids to be together. This is important for our mental health as a family. We're going to take this risk. And it shouldn't be hard to find testing if that kind of can add that one layer of extra security.
Great. And I know we have a couple of preschool administrators on the call, and I know there are specific guidelines regarding preschools. I'm wondering if either, I'm going to call them out. Hopefully they don't mind.
Yeah.
Erika or Corey would be willing to answer the question of what that looks like returning back to preschool, because I know it's a little bit different. If either one of you wants to jump in, I will. I don't know. Is Erika still on? Is Corey?
Yeah, I'm on. My face isn't, for some reason, my camera's not showing, so I apologize, but I am here.
I won't spotlight you then. You can just be the voice.
Yeah.
And so Erika Sayers is the director of preschool at Portland Jewish Academy in the infant toddler program and
so
preschool.
The travel policy is really, for at Portland Jewish Academy, is really more about what your business or what your school is going to choose to do in regard to a travel policy. We haven't had much guidance from the ELD. I was actually on the meeting tonight, going over the amended rules, and it's really, they label it as a business decision. But for us at PJA, if a family goes on a trip, even if the family's vaccinated, the parents are vaccinated, we do still require a quarantine of the child since they're not vaccinated. So at this stage, they need to quarantine for 7 days, 48 hours before the 7th day. So day 5, they can go get tested. And if their test is negative, they're able to come back on the 7th day. So, and again, it's just protecting, it's just, since the children aren't vaccinated, if there was anything on the plane or in any kind of transportation, it's a layer to protect our community.
Great. Thank you. I don't know, Corey, if you had anything you wanted to add to that.
Hi. Yes. I mean, same thing that she said. Our policy is slightly different, which is confusing, but the thing that's similar is that it's a little bit more strict than the guidance that we received. So we require a 10-day quarantine, which we know they lifted it to 7, but we kept it at 10. We also include the option of testing out of quarantine if you don't have symptoms, and it's 72 hours, within 72 hours of travel. So we've taken what we like from the guidelines, and then we've created some things that are a little bit strict in accordance with the new guidelines right now. So it's fluid, but that's where we're at right now.
And a follow-up question,
I'd like
just
to add
yeah.
to that, Corey, is that I think it's really reasonable for schools to use the recommendation as a guideline, but then make, for example, like when the state said that bars could be open, that might not have been the best thing in the world. Like, that didn't mean it was safe to go to bars. So just because the state says, like, here's this guideline that you can shorten your quarantine to 7 days and get a test at 5, which is really, it's reasonable, but just because they say that doesn't mean it's the safest thing to do. So I think institutions and schools, depending on risk, depending on who you have, should make decisions that are the safest for their institution, and not necessarily just follow exactly. I mean, they shouldn't go below the CDC guidelines, but to go above and beyond whatever the guidelines often makes a lot of sense for an organization.
Thank you for saying that.
So Corey, just FYI, is the assistant director at Foundation School at Congregation Neve Shalom. Thank you both, Erika and Corey, who are a part of our amazing preschool cohort of educators here in Portland, for jumping on. I knew they would be okay with me calling on them. To follow up, actually, this is probably going to be for Corey and Erika again, but really either any of our panelists. Is it just that if the child travels with the parents, or does this impact the entire household if a vaccinated parent travels independently alone?
The way we're reading it and making sense right now is it all depends on if there's any symptoms in the household. So if the adult travels away and there's no symptoms, then the adult is not picking up the child from school and stuff and kind of actively quarantining from the school. If anyone develops symptoms in the house, especially fever, shortness of breath, the ones that we really correlate with COVID, then that's a game changer. And then they go into the category that I listed earlier, which is quarantine 10 days, unless you test out 72 hours within 72 hours of symptoms or exposure. So see, it's a mouthful.
Thank you. Erika, is there anything different for your program?
No, and I just want to reiterate, if a family chooses not to get tested, they do have to do a 10-day quarantine as well. So I think our travel policies are pretty similar. If just a parent goes out of town and is vaccinated, they don't have to do anything except for monitor symptoms. If a family is not vaccinated, then they need to quarantine for at least the 10 days. They won't be able to drop their child off.
Okay, thank you. Can we have unmasked vaccinated babysitters, and can our children be unmasked with them?
I would think yes, but how many are you going to have? I mean, generally, if you know they're vaccinated and it's your regular babysitter, then I think it's okay for the vaccinated babysitter not to be masked. But if you if you're a family that has to use like a caregiver.com, multiple babysitters coming in, then again, we get to those bigger numbers, then I would just be safer and have everybody masked, because it's just too many numbers. But like your regular babysitter who's vaccinated shouldn't have to mask kids at home.
Okay. Can we have, how will the COVID-19 vaccine interfere or influence other childhood vaccine requirements? I know I've heard a little bit about this in terms of timing.
Yeah, and the timing thing has been lifted. Once the 12-year-old, it became really significant because 12-year-olds is a time when we have some vaccines due as kids enter middle school. So the HPV, the meningitis vaccine, the tetanus booster. And so a lot of kids were delaying their vaccine or the COVID vaccine. And the CDC did come out and say that was just, they sort of threw that out there because they weren't able to study COVID vaccine with other vaccines as they typically can do in a different situation. And now there's really no science behind the idea that they would interfere with each other. They're not live virus vaccines. They don't use that part of the immune system that would interfere with how our vaccines work. So that will be an issue possibly with some of our childhood vaccines, and we will make clear guidance. And they are looking at all the kids in the study are getting routine vaccines. So hopefully we'll have some good info. Hi, Sherry.
I see Sherry too. And feel free to raise your hand if you're comfortable asking questions, or you can put them anonymously to me in the chat or in the chat itself, or continue to use our link. If most kids in a class, and this is either for the older kids or for in a few months from now, if most kids in a class are vaccinated, how much do we need to worry about the unvaccinated kids? If there isn't, for example, if there is a kid in the class or program who isn't vaccinated, should they be excluded? That's a two-part question.
So we're now asking about like the future when young children are going to be able to be vaccinated. Is that what?
Or the 12 to 16-year-olds now who are.
Yeah. Okay. So, okay, will you say the question one more time?
Absolutely. If most kids in a class are vaccinated, how much do we need to worry about the unvaccinated kids? We'll start with that part.
Okay. Great question. If there's one unvaccinated kid and the rest are vaccinated, you do not have to worry very much at all. And it depends on how big the class is. So those numbers are just going to become significant. It's kind of like you've heard about herd immunity. Also, we protect each other. So those unvaccinated kids are protected by a bubble of vaccinated kids. If that unvaccinated child's parents are vaccinated, that's another level of protection. I think the vaccinated kids are protected against that child. If you're looking at it from that perspective, probably worried about the vaccinated kids or the unvaccinated kids. But there's going to be a number. I mean, I think it's not going to be unreasonable to require this vaccine. Personally, I'm hoping that it is required. as we have more and more data. I don't think it should be required when it's still emergency use authorization, but as soon as it gets full FDA approval and we have more numbers, I think it's very reasonable to require it for schools.
And if there is a kid, once it is available to all kids of all ages, if there is a kid in a class or a program who isn't vaccinated, should they be excluded? I don't even know if that's legal.
I don't know if so it is legal in some levels. I mean, there are vaccines. I think it'll be like other vaccines. So for example, now if you choose to not have your child vaccinated in the public schools, the parents, they can be excluded. So there are certain vaccines, and COVID will likely be on that list. There are ways to go around that. You can go right now in the state of Oregon, you'd have to go on to a website and fill out a questionnaire or watch a video and sign it off, and then you can be considered excluded from the vaccine. But there is a method to do that. But generally, everybody who has kids, I mean, if most of your kids are vaccinated, you haven't had this, but there are letters that come out every year called Exclusion Day. It's usually in February, and that's when public schools will exclude kids whose vaccines are not up to date. But we'll see if that happens with COVID.
A lot of these questions are for Dr. Meyer. Okay, Dr. Meyer, do we have any recently updated data on the prevalence for children of long COVID? Example, the odd secondary effects that could have really long-term health impacts.
It's worrisome. We don't have a lot of data, but we have seen it in children, just, probably similar to the rates in adults, but maybe not as reportable. And there have been fewer cases of COVID in children than adults. But yeah, it's possible. This virus can attach to a lot of parts of our body, not just our lungs, and giving us obvious symptoms. And so, yeah, I think it's one of the worrisome things about this virus are these unknown effects of, hopefully they won't be that serious. I mean, kids seem to be recovering beautifully, and kids have incredible immune systems, especially for those of you with kids under 5, their immune systems are like, I like to call them atomic bombs of new, I mean, not to be horrible with them, but they really, their immune systems come on fire and kill things well. So I would be surprised if there was anything in the young children like long COVID, but theoretically it would be a risk. And their immune systems, I mean, they're just sort of good at like clearing out everything. I mean, we know that they can't fight certain things. I shouldn't say their immune systems are capable of everything, but they've been pretty good at this.
If adults are masked, how much safer or not are they to be around children if they're vaccinated?
If adults are masked
how much
and vaccinated?
Yeah. If the adult is vaccinated, I believe. I'm going to ask for some clarification on this question. I'll go to another question in the meantime. Because I'm reading it. If adults are,
read it again. I think
if adults are masked, how much safer or not are they to be around children if they're vaccinated?
Oh, they're very safe. If they're vaccinated and masked, they're very safe to be around children. Unvaccinated children. I think
that was my question. I'm just going to rephrase it. I'm sorry. I'm trying to tease out.
Are you talking about like your teachers, right, maybe?
Right, like any adults in the building, if we don't want to walk that hairy line of finding out who's vaccinated and asking for proof, if adults are wearing masks, how much greater of safety measure is it if they're vaccinated or not? Like, is it worthwhile if they're all masked? Am I making sense now?
Yeah, I think so. If adults are masked, it does provide safety. If they're unvaccinated and masked and they're indoors for a prolonged period of time, they would still be considered at risk. So an unvaccinated adult, even wearing a mask, close contact with a lot of kids indoors, it's going to be a significant risk. Outside, less so, but and in an indoor where there's lots of air, because and it depends on the mask as well. An N95 protects you quite well if the mask is, a close fitting mask. doesn't really protect you that well, actually. Some of, like, for example, I just got this beautiful mask as a gift, and it's really tight and it's great. But when you need some space between your nose and mouth and the mask for it to be more effective. So, I mean, there's a lot in the quality of masks. A lot of teachers I've seen at schools have these beautiful masks, but they're not necessarily, I mean, if I was a teacher, I think I would wear an N95 if I could get my hands on one. If I wasn't going to be vaccinated, which would never happen in the history of the world. But
Thank you.
Okay. For our children's mental health, how risky is it to allow play dates indoors, maskless, with other children whose parents are all fully vaccinated?
okay. This is, again, you have to keep your numbers small. Like, this isn't time to do that with everybody. So we still kind of want to have, like, so if you have kind of a group, if you have children and they're in the same preschool and all the parents are vaccinated and these kids are already in the same school, I think those would be great families to have indoor play dates with, where the kids are already around each other in the same risk pool and the parents are all vaccinated. But I probably wouldn't do that with a lot of different families, because at some point you're going to bring in, your kids are going to get exposed. I mean, as numbers get, hopefully positivity rate just keeps going, will go down and down and down, and it will be less of a risk, but it's a risk.
I know this was definitely one of the questions that was on the list I brought you a month ago. So.
Yeah. Did I have the same answer today?
You did. Yes. Same answer. Is it safe for a vaccinated grandparent to travel by plane and come stay with an unvaccinated child in our home unmasked? They will wear a mask during travel, but I am concerned about other people on the plane.
Yeah. I think a plane, so airplanes are not as unsafe as you would think. You're not exposed to 300 people on the airplane with you. That vaccinated grandparent with the mask on and being careful is really just exposed to the few people around them in the airplane. When you see how things spread in airplanes, you're spread with the people that you're kind of sharing more of, like, and so I think it's actually relatively low risk. A vaccinated, and I always tell people, keep your plans flexible. Like, if that grandparent arrives and says, oh my God, I was sitting next to this person who wouldn't wear their mask, or this coughing kid, or, you know, if they felt like they had an exposure, then they should quarantine before they're around the kids unmasked. But a relatively safe travel where you didn't really come in contact, I think, I mean, I've had to travel, I've been on a plane during COVID, and I felt like you kind of know, like, there was that guy whose mask was down here with, I didn't have that guy, but you can see these are the people you're around, are the people you see. So you don't have to worry about the person you can maybe hear coughing way in the back of the plane, because airplanes circulate their air quite well. There's HEPA filters, air is coming in. You're not breathing, even though it feels stuffy and horrible on an airplane, you're not breathing everybody's air on an airplane.
We're going to give Dr. Meyer a breather for a second and pass it over to Dinah. Dinah, I have a 3-year-old. Should I try to explain the pandemic to him? I haven't yet done this.
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things that I would ask is what the activities are like of the 3-year-old. Is it a 3-year-old who is home with you all the time? Is it a 3-year-old that's in preschool? So if a person just wants to give more information, I'd be glad to respond sort of more specifically to that.
Home with me all the time.
With you all the time. Right. Okay. And so any questions being asked? Any going outside to the park where you've had to leave suddenly? Anything coming up that?
Charlotte, if you want to unmute, you're more than welcome to. You don't have to. I know you have a little one at home, or a couple little ones.
Hi, I have.
Oh. Charlotte, we can't hear you. Charlotte, when you're back on, let us know. Your videos or your audio seems to have gone away.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I have a 3.5-year-old at home. He's going to preschool in the fall. We go outside a lot. He wears his mask very well, but he's never asked why. he's never asked about any of this stuff. And I just wonder, should I explain this to him or kind of just let him ask questions when he's ready?
What do you think? Where are you at with it? I mean, are you ever kind of wondering what he's thinking, or sort of like,
Yeah, I do wonder, I guess, because I've just said I'm wearing a mask because it all started when he was 2 years old. And I just said, you need to wear a mask. I'm wearing a mask because it was the easiest. But now that he's a little bit more communicative, he's starting to ask questions about other things, and like he's curious about his world. So I guess I want to tell him that this is not normal. I don't know if that's something I should do.
so this is my response, Charlotte. I think when a subject isn't spoken about or not addressed, it sort of gets harder along the way to sort of open it up, bring it up. And so early on, it may be a conversation about a mask, and it may be a statement that you make about the mask, and it can be a general statement. And it may even be, let's put on a mask. With kids right now, the 3-year-olds that I've been working with, masks are part of their daily habit. They remind their parents when they're being dropped off that the parent needs to put on the mask to go inside, and they don't really attach anything to it. So it's not like there's something bad, so I have to wear the mask. It's really become at that age more like, this is part of my daily routine. I'm going to get dressed and I'm going to put on my mask. And it sounds as though it's become a daily routine. And I think that to address that, yep, remember your mask, and to start to talk about a mask in a way that's not scary, is very helpful early on, because otherwise it becomes the secret.
Charlotte, I have a 3.5-year-old, and the way we've always phrased it, she did go back to preschool. We've always phrased it as, we're doing this to keep all our friends safe and healthy. And that seems to have worked really well for us. And I'm happy, you can feel free to message me. I'm happy to talk about how we phrased it with our kids. Cool. So looking into the summer, can we talk a few scenarios? So outdoor play dates, parks, day camps, what should we be aiming for as we get into warmer weather? In terms of what's
safe.
You
should be doing all of those things. You should be outside. You should be, the things that are open that you feel safe and good about. But I think being more and more, we've seen it doesn't spread well outside. This virus likes to be kind of around. So is that kind of the question, more about that, or more about,
Yep.
I really think kids should be at parks, should be outside, and it's okay to play with other kids outside.
And should they be masked at public playgrounds?
Some of this is going to depend on your child. The guidelines of masking outside are not really based on anything that we know about spread. So masking outside has not really made a lot of sense to a lot of people, but it does protect kids, and now that we know it's not so much of a spread through contact, like we were worried initially about kids getting it from the slide. And so wearing a mask protected kids from touching their nose and mouth, and then, touching surfaces, but we're not seeing that kind of surface spread significantly, if at all. So you have that part, helpful. Parks, so if you're at a public park, you don't know whose kids are there. You don't know the parents. You don't know. There's just too many unknowns. So I would still feel more comfortable having kids wear masks at a public park with lots of different people. Like, if you're somewhere where you just don't know, and it's probably just a little bit safer for them, for the kinds of things that kids do, touching their nose and mouth and face, and just, getting into kids. Kids do things. I was just with my niece and a little boy that at my mom's house, it's her grandma, and another little boy who's about 5 years old just walked right up to her, and he was being babysat by his grandma. He just walked over and offered her a bite of his cookie, because because she thought it looked good, and like it went right in her mouth. I was just like, kids do that stuff. They're not thinking. So if she had been wearing a mask, that cookie would have just went right into the mask.
So along actually the lines of food, what about potluck style food? And does it matter if the food is prepared by an unmasked person?
You want your food to be prepared probably by a vaccine, but it doesn't really transmit that way. And it's just not, there are other things you can get. So, you want your There are other viruses, E. coli, rotavirus, norovirus. There's plenty of things you can get from a potluck, but it doesn't seem to be COVID.
Okay. This might be for our preschool staff on the call. Do the travel quarantine policies apply to traveling by car, like to the coast or something, camping for a few days?
Well, ours specifically says out of state, which sometimes I think is a little bit bananas, but that's just us because we're a whole organization. So, but ours does say if you leave the state of Oregon, you need to follow our travel policy, which has been really challenging for some families. Are like, I'm going to Leavenworth and we're only going to be with our family in our hotel and we're not going to go anywhere. And it's just really hard to make exceptions for people. And so that's the hard part, I think, about being on the other end of this, is just making sure that you're always consistent with everybody. I tend not to like to be I actually do like to be a black and white person and make black and white decisions at times. But it feels really important right now to just really be consistent. It's not about not trusting, it's just setting a standard that, again, creates a safe environment for everybody.
Great, thank you.
Rachel, I just have to make one more, especially since this is being recorded, one more potluck comment.
Yes.
We're talking outside picnics, because just for the record, there have been some serious outbreaks linked to potlucks that were in like the lunchrooms at an office where people were, there's even one at a hospital that I had heard about where, you know, all of the hospital staff was coming in, and granted it was a higher risk place at the hospital, removing their masks. This was before vaccinations actually, but still, you know, potlucks, it wasn't because of the food, it was because everybody was taking off their masks to sit and eat together. And so eating indoors with people would be a high risk activity for unvaccinated people.
Good, thank you. So I'm going to try to get through the last few questions. If our presenters are willing to stay on for a few more minutes, that's wonderful. If not, I will try to wrap things up. But there have been reports of heart rates increasing in a few kids after receiving the vaccine. I know they're still looking at the possible correlation. Is there any information on this that can be shared at this point?
Yeah, I don't know if you're talking about the myocarditis or the heart inflammation that was reported after the vaccine, or just rapid heart rate. You know, rapid heart rate is a very non-specific symptom, but there have been some reports of myocarditis. Initially, we were seeing that in the data from Israel, and Israel had published when they had 5 million doses of Pfizer vaccine, they had seen 63 cases of myocarditis, and for the most part, those were actually in young men. A vast majority of them were men under 30, and at that time was only 16 to 30. 16 and up that was getting it. So that was worrisome, but that's a rate of 0.001% approximately. So it's a pretty rare finding, and the CDC did just come out with the data that we were seeing in the US once we started opening up Pfizer to the 12 and up, that it didn't seem to be at a greater rate than the general population or with any other vaccine, or even just with the rates of myocarditis that we're seeing. Myocarditis is an inflammation of the heart that can be caused by a virus, and often it's quite mild. If you did have inflammation with a rapid heart rate and someone had symptoms, absolutely need to get that evaluated and checked out, certainly, especially if it was with shortness of breath. So we're watching for these things, and they are being reported. I think I've seen some people who are really afraid of the vaccine are worried that things are not being reported. And I think they've been reported more than almost any other vaccine. I mean, because everybody's on such high alert that anything they notice or perceive after getting the vaccine is getting linked to the vaccine, which is good because we can still look and see like what's the background noise versus something actually happening. But I don't have any information more than that. And so far, at first, I was a little alarmed when we first started getting more numbers of 12-year-olds and up, and I started hearing about the myocarditis. I was a little worried about that, and that some of those cases that were evaluated, but I'm feeling much better about it. That's very low risk.
Okay. What is the time span from when someone gets vaccinated and we have to start being cautious about protection fading again, and therefore being unmasked or being around my unmasked child?
It's only still been, it hasn't been that long yet. So I think it looks like vaccination lasts a little bit longer than they were saying 3 months, then 6 months. And like, as time goes on, they're showing pretty strong immunity lasting out, well beyond 6 months. A lot of, most of the providers who got it in December and January are coming up on that 6 months and kind of wondering, should we be getting a booster? And so far, it looks like the immunity is still quite strong at that point. So I think there will be a booster at some point. I don't know when.
Okay. Is swimming in public pools safe? No, we can't wear masks, but especially, swim safety is an important thing as well. And along that line, do I have a right to ask an instructor if they're vaccinated?
I think you can ask anybody if they're vaccinated. I do think, they don't have to answer you, but I think it's reasonable to ask, just say, I'm worried about, I think that's a good question. I would stick with outdoor pools if you can. Chlorine actually kills the virus quite well. So the water in the pool has that protective effect, but I would stick with physical distancing as much as possible. I would have a vaccinated instructor. I really wouldn't want, my unvaccinated child with an unvaccinated instructor because of how close they have to be, even indoors. So that's my advice.
Okay. And I'm going to end on what do you think we can expect for the school next year? What do you think the guidelines are going to look like? How many children in a classroom is safe? Will they likely still be masked?
I think likely they might still be masks indoors. Going back to what I said, I don't know what the schools are going to do. I will just, say what I think, but this is just what I think. Vaccinations, I think, are very likely to be available for all school-age children by the fall. And I think it's possible that schools will be pretty, not want to have anybody kind of sprain their ankle right before the end of the marathon and be very strict for the first month of, schools start back in late August, early September, but we haven't had a chance to get everybody vaccinated. I think schools might come down even stronger than ever just for that short amount of time. I would think that would be a wise thing to do, offer, it's just, you're so close. And if we can't get kids vaccinated till October, it might be a good idea to just, do things really different and then open up and be normal once everybody's vaccinated or has everybody who's eligible is able to be.
Great. Dinah, Dr. Meyer, any last words before I give a few closing remarks?
I would just say that this isn't a time to be a perfect parent, and for all of you to give yourself lots of slack and to show self-compassion.
I wanted to say, and I loved what Rabbi Eve said initially about that you have do-overs. That kind of goes along with what Dinah said, is that don't forget, we have the chance for do-overs. And so that means you have on both sides of things. That means it's okay to say no and not do something, and it's going to be okay. You'll have another chance to do it. Everything seems kind of so critically important sometimes when our children are young, and that we just have to go to this birthday party, or what will happen if we miss this, and the most important thing we know even for long-term health outcomes, not just for COVID, but I'll even say specifically for COVID, your children's immune systems and yours work the best when you're less stressed. So the things you do to feel connected and to feel calm and to take care of yourself are going to probably be as important as your vaccine. So we feel so good about getting the vaccine, but you should feel just as good about the things you do to care for yourselves, for your partners, for your children. Just hanging out and hugging them and connecting to your children is helping them fight this.
Thank you, Dinah, Dr. Meyer, Rabbi Posen. Thank you so much for being here tonight and answering the questions of our community. I will be sending out a brief survey tomorrow to help us just get some feedback and thoughts for upcoming programming. If you're interested in staying on, I will stay on for a few moments. I am going to stop the recording now, but thank you again for being here tonight. It was really helpful, and I know this has been so important for our community.
Thanks, everybody.